react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying danger in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, 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 yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh. You did a bust. Oh, 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 oh,
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and with us today is Aaron Rabinowitz. Mr. Rabinowitz, Aaron, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. I already, before we get to the meat of the matter, it was interesting. You guys, especially you and 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿 were already discussing a number of topics that I think would be interesting. We're going to have you back, I think, to discuss some of the other social issues, especially when it comes to politics. Conservative and liberal is one that we often talk about on this show for obvious reasons. So that was already a delightful conversation. Yeah. I'd like to remind
your co-host that when you put me in a room with a conservative, I go into question mode because I want to know things.
Most of the channel leans left, so on occasion we've had, and all our regular audience knows it's Andrew, and I think everyone appreciates him. Every now and then we get new people here who are like, "Who's the conservative?" And it's sort of like, "Well, hey, he's a co-host. Back off." So believe me, he's had worse. Unfortunately, I'm not proud of that. At any rate. Before we get started, too, I want to remind people, Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have Operator Starsky on. He's going to be covering Ukraine with us. He is a Ukrainian National Guardsman. He's been on the front lines. He's actually been pulled back to Kyiv. But obviously, those conversations we feel are important, and we're looking forward to having him back on Friday. He's got Starlink now. He's got power now. He can generate his own power, but Ukraine has been intermittently up to 90% without power, and that usually means no internet. So we're lucky to get him when we can. And we also are expecting Commander McMillan for downtime on Thursday, and then tomorrow we're going to be doing. Is it tomorrow? I'm going to have to sort that out with the holiday special that we've got planned. So we'll be talking with.
Tomorrow is Wednesday, the 28th.
Yep. Tomorrow's Wednesday. I'm on like 3 hours of sleep, so I'm gonna be all over the place today. My condolences in advance to the audience. Yeah, we'll have to push back the McMillan. Or we'll get him in. We'll probably get him into the holiday stream anyway. So thank you all for joining us. On our Discord, we've been talking a lot. We're always talking about current events and how to frame it. One of the things that we've talked about with McMillan has been, is the U.S. in maybe even in a cold civil war? What's the likelihood of civil war? We've been talking about civil war more than at any time that I'm aware of in modern history. People have been very concerned about this. McMillan has studied wars of all kinds, gave us his opinion on it. We've had a number of different people's opinions. Now, recently, there has been an uptick, a significant uptick in shootings at power stations. These happen all the time. They average about 90 a year, actually. We are up to over 100, I think it's 114 for this year so far. And one of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of these attacks are usually it's people shooting randomly at substations and doing some damage, but it appears, at least, as if recently some of these attacks have been getting more proficient and planned. And so we've been concerned, okay, is this domestic terrorism? Are these people who have an agenda? And I'd like to make one correction, and Aaron made this with me earlier, and I appreciate that. I double-checked. It was widely believed that the first shooting in, I think was it North Carolina, the one? Yes. It was widely believed that was the result of it was essentially a protest to a drag show, but actually, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence that is the case. Now, the drag show was going on at the time. Again, these things happen a considerable amount, and they do appear to be increasing in frequency. So it's very difficult to say that I'm aware of. There's no evidence that does link them per se. So that was a good correction, and I think that's worth noting. But before we get into all of that, Aaron, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself so that our audience knows who you are, and then let's get started.
Sure. No one is interesting as a general or anything like that. I am a PhD student. I have been teaching in philosophy for about the past 10 years. My background is in analytic philosophy, primarily moral philosophy at all the different sort of levels applied up to metaethics. And I've been teaching, all sorts of different courses, AI ethics, intro to ethics kind of things, with a master's. And finally got to a point where they were, I was enjoying doing it. It was going well, but they were like, it'd also be great for you to finish. So I'm working on a PhD in education, actually, in particular, because my real concern is sort of moral education and the lack thereof. in secular society. And I'm particularly focused, as your co-host unfortunately had to find out, in the issue of luck. I'm obsessed with discussions around luck and how they impact our thinking about responsibility and what people deserve, those kinds of things. So I'm working, I just finished my qual exam, so I'm going to be starting my dissertation on that for the next couple of years. And when I'm not doing that, I'm very interested in issues around conspiracy theories. So I do work with the UK Skeptic Mag, not the Michael Shermer one, where, you know, I talk about specifically like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the rise of conspiracism in right-wing politics in America in particular, and also sort of random various other topics. So that's part of, I guess, why I'm happy to chat about this subject. I think that like there's an important conversation to be had about the place of conspiratorial thinking in politics right now. And there's a lot of like really, I think, not functional conversation happening about that. So I think it's important to discuss that separate from the question of like, are these particular events actually instances of stochastic terrorism or something?
Well, so let's start with that. Let's start with the large, and what have been your observations about the tone of the discourse? Essentially, start where you want to. I was going to say starting with essentially when Trump left office, but frankly, the tone of the discourse had already changed dramatically before he came into office. But certainly since he came out of office, the rise of conspiracy theories. I mean, we had Pizzagate, obviously, before he came into office, but now conspiracy theories about people having essentially their vote taken from them, about the failure, the quote, the failure of democracy, and the increase in hostility that's causing. Could you talk about what your observations have been about those changes over the last whatever course of time that you think is appropriate?
Yeah, and I think it's important. Let me just first mention, when I do the conspiracy work, I also often talk about things like what I call moral panics. For folks who are not, this term is going to become, I think, more mainstream again, but just to make clear what this means, this is a situation where you have maybe a real problem, but that problem gets blown out of proportion or misrepresented in a way, often to gin up political concern. So one example would be something like QAnon, which is both a conspiracy theory and a kind of moral panic centered around, you know, the issue of human trafficking, which is a real thing. But as is often the case with moral panics, they tend to actually undermine attempts to address the thing that they are actually trying to address. So, you know, when I approach this stuff, I'm often trying to, you know, like ask, you know, is this a real thing? Are we, you know, overly panicking about it? There are some folks who argue that like even the concern about conspiratorial thinking is itself a kind of moral panic right now. And there's always a problem of, you know, media will tend to overhype things when they think that it will produce attention. And so there's a natural urge for them to kind of increase panic about almost everything at this point. So I think those are things to sort of put in as context. Another thing I want to put as sort of like, you know, key context, I do think there is a unique problem on the right in American politics right now with conspiratorial thinking and potentially violence related to conspiratorial thinking. That doesn't mean it's always the case that this is only a right-wing problem. There are examples of left-wing conspiracy theories, examples of left-wing violence and stochastic terrorism. The difference, I think, is that left-wing politicians in America right now are not actively promoting conspiratorial thinking in the way and degree that right-wing politicians are right now. And that would be, I think, where we would want to locate our genuine concern, that things like January 6th are, you know, particularly disconcerting for a couple of reasons. One is that a bunch of people came together and committed an act of violence specifically motivated to, you know, overthrow a democratically elected government, you know, weapons caches. Like, there was a degree of organization there that I think should worry everybody. But also I think the real concern should be that, like, elected officials were stoking this right up through the events themselves, and like there was a lot of support for this and continues to be a lot of support. And the fact that like Liz Cheney was kicked out of the Republican Party essentially for not being willing to go along on the big lie, I think should be one of the most worrying things out there right now.
And we've got Sinister Porpoise, member for 5 months. So super chats, and this is an important reminder for the channel. Super chats do go to the 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐼𝐸 Fund. So she wants to turn him into a socialist, and best way to do that is yeah. So that's what. Okay, thank you for the reminder, Sinister. There's an interesting tension there. Okay, so we're a news and educational program. I admittedly feel the desire to sometimes like oh my God, this is what's going on. This is crazy. Helps get views. I get attention. The show gets you got to try to pull that back. On the flip side, you also want to make sure that you're talking about things and that your things that are important are getting out there. So that I can tell in that sort of rundown that you just did. You talked about the media, and you talked about politicians, and then you had also mentioned that the conversation was I don't remember what you had said, but let's say dysfunctional. So how about you maybe pick one of those that you want to start with, and let's dissect that for a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you could go at this a couple of different ways. I think you could criticize the portrayal of conspiratorial thinkers in the media. You could criticize the levels of denial that people are in about it, politically speaking, in terms of the degree to which this animus is driving as the sole energy driving the Republican Party at this point. I think you can talk about the really, I think, unfortunate feedback loops between social media and traditional media in terms of stories like the power transformers being attacked stuff that you mentioned at the beginning, where you have, as far as I can tell, a bunch of people claiming that investigators said the thing might have been linked to the drag queen story hour stuff, but there's been no verification of that as far as I can tell. And that's you want to be really careful about that stuff, because you want people to be able to trust when those kind of claims are made that they are legitimate. And I worry that there's too much rush to claim that particular things are motivated in this way. So, for example, most recently, you have this Washington state vandalism event, and it's being sort of portrayed as kind of in line with these other events where it seems like the MOs appear to be different. And so you want to worry that the media is doing its own sort of conspiratorial baking when it's just piecing together. Like you said, there are lots of these kind of weird attacks. They aren't all connected. So instead, I think we need to be having better conversations about, the organized history of militia movements in America and the specific goals, things like the Day of the Rope, and talk about what could be in the minds of the individuals who do seem to be potentially engaged in testing and improving attacks on infrastructure in this kind of way, because it does seem plausible, at least, that these are part of an organized project of disrupting services during a particular period, for the sake of all sorts of potentially, harmful goals, right? So I think being more focused in our concerns on stuff like that, I think, is important. At the same time, I think the media has a real trouble with both sidesing, and maybe your conservative co-host can comment on whether he experiences this as well. But I do think that in their desire to appear neutral as media individuals, they struggle to be explicit about saying that, look, there's a really serious asymmetric difference, and in this two-party system, if one of those parties is this far off the rails, the whole system goes off the rails with them, and it's not clear what we're supposed to do about any of that. So yeah, I think those are, I guess, a couple of the points that I wish I want us to be a little more sort of precise about.
What do you think? You said that the right, this, and I think that was an excellent point that you made. It's not just, hey, the right's always doing this kind of thing. The left has had its own significant problems. We also discuss that, in terms of genocide. It's like, oh, well, take a look at the genocide on the right. Yeah, take a look at Chairman Mao. I mean, it's not just so. But you had said that. So that right now it's the right. What do you think in the United States inspired the right to get into the position that it's in now, where Liz Cheney, who, I mean, she's a Cheney, for crying out loud, gets drummed out of the party. Yep. People can't stand up and
She's
say,
part of the family that will shoot you in the face. Yep.
Yeah, well, that did in one case. Yes, that is exactly. So, well, how did the right get there?
Yeah, and I mean, if you've been watching any of the Jan 6 investigations, I think Liz Cheney is going to, in fact, shoot some more people in the face.
What is this? What do you mean what is this January 6th thing you're talking about?
The January 6th congressional meetings.
We may have covered every single one of second of every single one of them live in most cases. So
I apologize for implying that you weren't deeply involved with all of that. Good, yeah. So you're you get where we're at. You get the concern. I mean, so my answer, as far as I can tell, looking at the history, is, racism and capitalism, I think, are the two answers. And you could argue that those are not separable things. You could argue that our modern understanding of racism, and this is getting into the critical theory world, that racism is a tool of modern capitalism, that capitalism evolves out of colonialism. Colonialism is a process of extracting and consolidating large amounts of wealth. And it's done by creating a cultural ideology that says that certain individuals deserve to be exploited in this kind of way, or at least don't deserve to not be exploited in this kind of way. And so you get racism in the modern sort of approach to it. Not to say there were not forms of exploitation that happened prior to this, but that you see like the real construction is specifically of like Black people in particular, but also the sort of the race, like the race science of the 1500s, and then jump-started by evolutionary theory into eugenics, which we know how that ends up. So you have that, and in America in particular, you have a kind of capital.
Nope, you're breaking. That I think. All right.
Am I back?
Yep. You're back. All right. Please continue.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So, what I was saying was, you have the capitalist element in America, which has a fear of communism that dates back to at least the Civil War. There's hilarious quotes from the president of the Confederacy being like, the attempts to emancipate slaves are the beginning of communism, or like the beginning of the tip of the spear of like taking away private property. And there's a really interesting book that the first 5,000 years, I think, or something like that, that's about that talks about the connection between the concept of private property and the history of slavery. So it's that's an interesting conversation, and where I think you really see this come together in America is the civil rights period, where you have massive social upheaval beginning. A period of what I would consider social progress that has sort of shakily moved along for the past 60 years, where you've had, the expansion of rights for individuals, not just racially, but gender and, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. And that process has been sort of actively, very strongly resisted by conservatives in America. And what you get is something like the Southern Strategy, which is this, I would argue, real process by which the Republicans, through some mix of actual racism and political preference, decided that they were going to focus on white people. And they, there's the Lee Atwater quote about how they use increasingly obscure, dog whistles to continue to convey these kind of racially economic, right? We have to understand that race and economy are always connected here, where the idea is these racial minorities are coming for your jobs. They're coming to, attack your women, like that kind of thing. They are violent. They're criminals, etc. And so you get, the rise of our criminal justice state, right? The, heavy levels of incarceration of mostly people of color. And all of this is backed by increasing conspiratorial thinking. You increasingly see discussions of the red scares, the pink scares, the lavender scares, like all these scares on the right are driven by a lack of, there's a lot of discussion about what drives conspiratorial thinking. I think it's a mix of a couple of things. It does appear to be correlated with certain other correlates of conservative mindsets like religious belief, but it's, I think, often driven by a felt sense of lack of control. And I think the most straightforward explanation in a lot of these cases is whether rich or poor, middle class or whatever, conservatives feel like they've lost the culture wars. They feel like they've been routed. They feel like they are overrun by people who disagree with them, and they feel like it's being backed by shady globalist elements. And that makes them just really good targets for this conspiratorial thinking. And then you get somebody like Trump who comes along and starts with birtherism and goes from birtherism into all the other conspiracies he can find. You're giving a permission structure to something that's been growing in these communities for 60 years now.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I want to pass it off to Zandering and give him some time, and then we'll go back and forth a little bit. But I did want to point out before I do that, your colleague in crime, Professor Christopher Mowdy, Rutgers Camden. Professor has said, quote, "It's based on insecurity," which sounds like that's what you're talking about. So, what I want to ask is, so what I want to ask though is, oh dear Lord, I did yes. The left is starting to feel threatened, I think, in a number of ways. Some of those threats, all of them real on some level. How real, I think, is maybe something we're going to discuss. But, for example, they feel threatened, obviously, because of January 6th, the one that, the candidate from the left won, and it feels like the right was trying to take that candidate away. And the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, almost as significantly, possibly more significantly, depending on, because at least the Supreme Court's been successful, has rolled back over 50 years, probably closer to 75 years of progressive successes in one Supreme Court session. Is there a danger that the left is going to start, that this is going to, because you had mentioned earlier too that about, it wasn't a pendulum, but that it sort of feeds off of each other. So is there now a danger that the left is going to feed off of this and start to become conspiratorial, start to say, well, we're going to have to get violent too, is that a concern you have?
Yes, it is. And so a couple of things, we should separate conspiratorial thinking from violence, right? First of all, the concern here certainly is the particular situation is such that it might be that conspiratorial thinking is going to lead to violence. But I think we should be worried about these two things separately because they can be separate kinds of harms. I think there's likely to be an increase in, there is a risk of an increase in conspiratorial thinking on the left. I would be more concerned about revolutionary violence than conspiratorial violence. Maybe that's like a too fine-grained a distinction or something like that. But I think, what they're more, and like I don't have a high expectation of large-scale violence on either side, to be honest. I don't think that our situation is bad enough that there's going to be a large number of people who would really love to enjoy taking up arms and engaging in warfare. I think what we're more concerned about is ongoing increased terror threats of various sorts. I don't think you're going to see a ton of that kind of terrorism on the left just because it's not where they're at for the most part at the moment. I do think there is talk online of the only way you're going to overthrow capitalism is through revolutionary violence. And I think that's unfortunately a conversation that has to be had, and like what role political violence has in our society is a conversation that I think we're too shy to talk about for fear of sounding like we are encouraging violence. But I also, what I'm concerned about is conspiracism, like anti-vaxxer conspiracism, which has always been a thing on the left as well as on the right, but it has become more politically right-wing as a result of the COVID vaccine situation. But I worry, for example, about the language of, indigenous or alternative ways of knowing that you see cropping up in what we call woke culture, for lack of a better term. And that kind of language is very easy to co-opt into anti-vaxxer conspiracism. I see that in anti-vaxxer material a lot. So I worry that it could make, that kind of being socially conscious could make you more vulnerable to this kind of conspiracism. And as for the loss of control, I do think you see some of that. I think where you see that a lot is when for example, I wrote an article about Hotep culture, which was 2 years ago, and now everyone knows what this is because of Kanye. But this is essentially black conspiracies, primarily black conspiracism, often tied to Egyptian Afrofuturist kinds of iconography. And that, some of the things I quoted were people talking about how people become Hoteps in prison, that like your Hoteps are born in a prison cell. And the idea being, if you're experiencing social oppression, you are at higher risk of believing conspiratorial thinking. There's a really valuable book, Silent Covenants, I think it's called, Derek Bell, and he talks about the history of white control. It's where he talks about interest convergence a lot. And it's interesting as a book because he points out specific real conspiracies, like the conspiracy to end Reconstruction in America in exchange for the presidency, which I didn't know about. I was never taught why Reconstruction was ended until I read that book. And like when you read that stuff, it's hard to, and this is a problem with modern conspiracism. It's hard to talk about because it's reasonable to be a conspiracy theorist in the modern world, which is to say, we know there are a bunch of actual conspiracies that have been proven. And if you're honest about what we mean by a conspiracy theory, it's not unreasonable to believe that certain individuals in a capitalist, empire, like all different kinds of places are engaged in conspiratorial activities. And then it becomes a really messy question of how do you distinguish between, like justified and unjustified belief in those kind of conspiracies.
All right. I've got a few questions from the live chat, but we'll hold off on those. I will get to those guys, but I do want to give 𝐒𝐤𝐻𝐸𝐿𝐷 a chance. He's been very patient, and I'd like to hear what he's got to say if you got any questions.
Oh, we bounced around quite a few different places. I guess going back to a little bit about media, having a difficult time, I guess, delineating between what we know as facts and what is commentary, and what we decide or what we think might be the causes of different things. The example we've given thus far is, the attack on the power substation in North Carolina being tied to the drag show that was being put on. And that whole idea got started because a woman was posted online, was like, "Oh, power's out, and I know why." And of course, she has absolutely no idea why. She has no evidence whatsoever to support anything. But she was like, it's because of the drag show. And so that's where that kind of all got started. And when you actually examine the evidence, you're like, well, we don't have anything to actually link these two together. It's just these two events were happening, and they've been linked together by media mostly. And now everybody thinks that's why it is. And, the delineation between what I would consider, just vandalism and actual targeted attacks to bring down the substation are huge. From what I can tell, like the substation attacks in Washington State, just outside of Tacoma and Pierce County, that's just vandalism. I mean, the people broke in and started beating things up, breaking things, which I have to warn people that there's lots of things inside of a power substation that you probably shouldn't touch if you value continuing to live. So I highly recommend not doing that. But then there's a huge difference between that and like what happened at the 𝐒𝐻𝐾 power substation in 2013. That was a very well thought out, very well coordinated actual attack on a power substation that did $13 million worth of damage in less than 20 minutes. And no one knows who did it. Well, actually, I should rephrase. Somebody knows who did it, but nobody has officially said who has done it. I have my own conspiracy theory. Conspiracy about it. They have announced no suspects, no nothing. They've made no arrests.
What's your conspiracy theory about it?
My conspiracy theory about it is, there's an actual timeline, and there's a couple of great videos if you actually just Google on YouTube, 𝐒𝐻𝐾 power substation. They took out 17 high voltage transformers in less than 23 minutes. $13 million, took a month and a half to replace them. And had they done it in a slightly different way, they could have taken down the power grid for pretty much all of central California, all of Silicon Valley, and much of the central part. But they targeted mostly the cooling tanks, the oil cooling tanks. And there was over 100 rounds fired at it. There is closed captioning, video surveillance of the site. Nobody was ever caught on video. There were 2 instances just prior to the attack where they cut the fiber optic cable lines for AT&T communications, which took out almost all of the 911 service in that general area. There were a few areas that still had phone service. One individual happened to have phone service at the actual 𝐒𝐻𝐾 power station, and he heard the attack going on. He heard all of the gunfire, called 911, and said, "Hey, it sounds like there's a war going on out there." They also, closer to right outside the power substation, they went into the local internet provider and took down all of the cables. And they were taken down in such a way, they were cut so that they could not easily be repaired. Somebody knew how to take out these cables in a way that would make it difficult to repair them. So all of the internet in the area also went down just before this attack happened, which took down many of the internal sensors and alarm systems for the power station itself. So had they decided to not focus on just the cooling tanks for the power station, then they could have taken the whole entire substation down in just the few minutes that they were actually firing at it. They could have set everything on fire and had a catastrophic failure of the power station. And had they had a catastrophic failure of the power station, it would have caused a cascading failure in the area. And instead, the transformers slowly overheated. The PG&E control center was able to get the alarm, hey, these things are overheating, there's a problem. One of the few alarms that actually still worked, and so they were able to route power around the substation to stop any cascading failures. On the video, you can clearly see what is believed to be somebody flashing a flashlight. The attack on the power substation commences.
What's your thesis, police, by the way? Hold on a second. Like you've dived into like 10 million pieces of evidence.
I'd like to.
There's. I'm sorry that I'm being so
No, you're
precise
very
about
conspiracy theory in the sense that like you've broken down all the pieces of details. But like, is this like the inside job theory? Because I thought this was actually one of the theories that investigators are holding at this point.
Yes, it's so far because they don't have any real evidence as to a motive for this. They don't know why. They don't have any suspects, any of that kind of stuff. And the sophistication with which this attack was carried out, the fact that they signaled the people who were firing, they believe it was between 2 and 6 people, 0 fingerprints on any of the shell casings. It was AK rounds that were used. So I think one of the leading kind of theories about this, and it has to be a conspiracy theory because this would be a conspiracy if it's true, is that it essentially was a false flag event. It was an inside job done by one of our alphabet agencies or special forces, specifically to shock everybody into how vulnerable our electrical infrastructure is. So that's kind of my
So they just
that it was
grossly miscalculated on how much we give a shit about our own infrastructure because nobody cared.
well, kind of. I mean, there's a reason why you can say, Metcalf, the attack nobody knows about.
Why wouldn't they put forward
because
patsies if they're gonna why wouldn't they have like fall people?
probably because
it's weird to not have any leads. You'd think they would be like, oh no, this was clearly white supremacists, and here they are. We've trotted them out.
No, because that would
right.
The reason I don't think they would have had any fall people or patsies is because it would have detracted from what they were trying to accomplish, which was the coordinated attack could cause a hell of a lot of damage, and we should be focusing on building up the infrastructure. And they wouldn't have wanted the fall guys, the example you gave, white supremacists or whatever, or Al-Qaeda infiltrating the country and attack. Well, the conversation would have been derailed from let's increase security at power substations, because an attack, clearly they're vulnerable to these attacks, and the narrative would have been shifted to, oh my God, it was white supremacists, or oh my God, Al-Qaeda is in the country, and everybody would have forgotten about let's beef up the security of the actual substation, which they did do. Security was built up.
Hold on. So the goal of the conspiracy was to get infrastructure spending?
More or less.
Okay.
To
this
harden our
seems like an
electrical
implausible conspiracy theory to me. This is not a Jeffrey Epstein feeling kind of situation for me personally.
All right. Well, did you?
And this,
anyway, so that I got way sidetracked on that. Sorry, I didn't. That was my little pet conspiracy. Was that because of the coordination?
I think it's a good case in point for talking about the difficulties of discussing conspiracy theories, because any theory about what happened to that substation will be a conspiracy theory in the sense that it will be about a conspiracy. And my friend Dentith, who does philosophy of conspiracy theory work on this, I think is totally right that we shouldn't only use the term conspiracy theory to refer to the most extreme, David Icke's and Alex Joneses of the world. That a conspiracy theory is literally just a theory where believing that people are engaged in, secret behavior towards a goal. And that could mean that a birthday party is a conspiracy. And if you think that your friends are organizing a birthday party, you're being a conspiracy theorist in that moment. And then it just becomes what's reasonable versus unreasonable in terms of what kind of conspiracies you think are actually happening. There's a real epistemic problem here, because if you believe enough that there are really powerful forces that could get away with what you're describing right there, there's really nothing that you can't make plausible, right? It could be plausible that the government is hiding aliens, and then it's plausible that there's alien technology, and then everything's on the table. Time travel, all of it's just that, we're off the races at that point, right? So yeah. I've been talking with Dan a lot about this, and how do you prevent implausible or unreasonable conspiracy theories if the nature of modern conspiracy theories makes everything plausible?
Well, and I think that media has a lot to do with this, because media tends to push narratives in the stories, even in just the selection of what they're going to cover and what they won't cover. And I've seen an appalling lack of distinction between what we know as actual fact and then what is commentary. And people like their news sources often for the commentary, as well as not only finding out what's going on. So when people start talking,
by the way, another thing that I think is asymmetrical to some extent. I think this is a bigger conservative problem because of Fox News and the way that right-wing media has been created as a quote-unquote alternative to mainstream media. I'm not saying that mainstream media is by any means perfect, but MSNBC is nothing compared to Fox News, and there's a reason for that, which is I don't think there's an equal feeling of a desire for alternative, where alternative means heavily curated to a particular narrative that is very far right, I would argue.
I don't really watch Fox News, so I can't really comment on the amount of curation.
I'm not sure there's a legitimate right-wing news source at the moment I would consider to be a decent, primarily reliable source of non, opinion-based reporting.
Is it Reuters on the right?
Yeah, and I don't.
Sorry.
I think.
No,
Sorry,
not really.
I thought Reuters was right leaning at least, but I could be wrong.
Depends who you ask and what moment of the day.
So I suppose. Anyways, apologies. What were we saying, Andrew?
Oh, right. There's some that I find that make a genuine attempt to try and be non-biased. I'm not entirely convinced that that's possible.
It may not
because
be.
everybody.
That's one of the critical theorist views, that it's impossible to be objective in that way.
Yeah, well, because what is important to you is going to shade what kinds of news, and how you. Even how you present facts. You can imply things even with just the way that you give out facts.
But I think you're
you've said
totally right.
nothing wrong.
Yeah, and I want to come back to what you were saying before you got into the conspiracy, and then we can talk about the theory a little bit. But I think it's very true that it's bad that everybody picked up on this idea that it was Drag Queen Story Hour that caused this attack, and that was what was going on there. And it does say, a couple of the articles say investigators believed that there might be a connection, or were exploring a connection or something like that. But it really did kind of run away as this is what actually was the cause. And I do think that's a real concern, because I think there is actually, the shooting that happened in Colorado, there really is an increase, I think, a growing concern about stochastic terrorism. On the right in particular, but mislabeling things or jumping the gun is very not helpful. Here I recommend my friend 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿, who does philosophy of a lot of things, but pornification of media is one of them. He has a really good sort of way of a heuristic where, if you read something or you see something and it's so sweet to your taste, your political taste buds, right? It's Drag Queen Story Hour busted for criminal, child trafficking ring or something like that, right? Hold off, right? It's too sweet. It's like high fructose corn syrup, right? It's been, chemically modified to fuck with your taste buds, and that makes it unlikely that it's true, right? It makes it unlikely that it's real material and not something made in a factory. So leave it, right? Don't immediately jump on the idea that it's this thing. Give it a couple of days. If it's real news, it will be broken by more reliable sources. And if it's not, it will disappear quickly. And the more people who do that, the fewer of these things that kind of get spread like wildfire that way.
Yeah, it's one of the I was going to ask you what you thought one of the solutions for trying to I guess kind of fix that issue so that we can be less conspiratorial minded. But one of the things that I've always, for quite a while, insisted that we really need to do is, teach philosophy, starting in kindergarten, teaching philosophy all the way through school, and critical thinking, so that we can start to possibly.
Of this, that would be really helpful, because the reason we don't do it is primarily, I think, religious conservatism in America. It's not the progressives who are preventing it. I think, I think the fear is that critical thinking, and if I start teaching ethics to elementary school students, I'm going to get parents complaining that I'm teaching the wrong ethics or indoctrinating their children or something like that. Even if I do a relatively comparative approach, I think I think there are lots of people who would love to see this happen, and you would see massive pushback from evangelicals if you tried it.
I guess it's. I guess I don't understand.
Well, so
I guess I don't understand that one.
Yeah, look at the pushback to the social justice agenda in schools right now, right? I would argue that that's an attempt by largely liberal individuals to promote a kind of ethical worldview that I think is good and should be promoted in schools, but is certainly at odds with various kinds of traditional fundamentalist worldviews. And so it is, in my opinion, a form of indoctrination in that sense.
Right. I was say I'm not up on the whole evangelical movement and what exactly they're up on, because I'm an atheist. So it's interesting to hear talk. I guess I can see it.
Yeah, you have a
I'm not
particularly
sure.
minority position. Most because of the sorting of our culture, there are not a lot of conservative. I know there's not a non-zero number of them, but like there's a dwindling, like similar to moderate conservatives, or the moderately religious. There is a kind of dwindling number of conservative atheists because those identities, I think, are increasingly at odds in our culture, in particular, right now. But that might be going too far afield to have that conversation. The conspiracy that you laid out about it being one of the alphabet groups doing this. Here's why, if we're going to play the game of what's plausible despite alien technology, I think that's less plausible because I don't think there's a clear motive. I don't think that it makes any sense really as a strategy for them. If they have that kind of power, there's much more effective ways, I think, to do what they're trying to do in that kind of situation. I think the most plausible explanation, again, would be right-wing militia groups, essentially with an insider, who worked at the factory and is sympathetic to their whatever ethno-nationalist interests they are adhering to. And the reason for me there is they're the ones who train for shit like this. Like, there aren't a lot of, in my opinion, there are not a lot of liberal organizations that are running field tests on attacking power stations right now. You do see them running, training for dealing with the police in Portland, right? They certainly have a lot of that kind of Antifa style, like what you might think of as semi-violent resistance or something like that, not fully non-violent resistance. But they're not interested in attacking infrastructure, I think, in this particular. And they're not as good with guns, if we're being honest, right? This is something where like you have to have people who are fairly competent with firearms in the way that I just don't think you see nearly as much of on the left as on the right. There are lots of people on the left who want that to change, right? There are lots of folks who would love to see more armed socialists in the world. But it's not as much of I think, a driving thing as in the culture on the right for lots of reasons.
But we have the same problem going your way as well, saying, okay, well, maybe it's a right-wing militia group. I would hazard that if you think that right-wing militia groups are proficient in firearms use, I recommend you actually go get to know a few of them.
Not all of them. Look, there's a large percentage of them that are LARPers. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. But here's what makes it so difficult is because nothing like it has happened since. What would have been the point of a militia group doing this? I mean, I know of no militia groups that are advocating for taking down the power grid, and that's essentially what this was. An attempt to take down an actual attempt to take down the power grid without actually taking down the power grid, because they could have taken it down and they didn't. The power didn't go down. There were a few people that lost power, very few, but the attack was done in such a way to give PG&E plenty of time to reroute power so that they didn't have a cascading failure, and they didn't have to do that, especially with over 100 rounds fired. And it's like the fact that nobody claimed any responsibility for it at all. It never happened. Another attack like that has not happened on the power grid since. And it's like, so what was the point of it? I mean, I can't seem to find a valid point for any group to have done this the way that it was done without any kind of follow-up whatsoever at all.
So here would be my alternative explanation. And again, we can't know, but I think this is going to be a more plausible explanation than they're doing this to get infrastructure week going again. What happened, there have been previous attacks like this that were less effective, as far as I know. And I think the theory would be this is an attempt to refine a technique that will be used on a larger scale at a predetermined time, right? So you do have militia groups who believe in things like the day of the rope, this idea that there's going to be a day where there's going to be massive race wars, where there's going to be, the hanging of lots of people and the returning to being a white Christian society or something like that. That kind of behavior is going to be easier to enact if your infrastructure is down, right? If your power is down, if your emergency services are down, if your, officers are reacting to situations like that. Now, I think they're not going to. I don't think that would work. I don't think that's a coherent, a functional strategy for inciting a race war. But I do think people believe it is, and I do think that I think there's a plausible story where their goal here was to test this out, and either they were hoping that it would cause a larger failure, but didn't know enough about the system, and so they were unsuccessful, but more successful than they had been previously, or they had an inside connection and they knew what they were doing and they were testing it with the expectation that they would do it on a larger scale the next time around, without any sort of leads or anything like that. You don't have a way to affirm one way or the other. But I think given the history of things, that's a more plausible explanation than, the government did it so that they could get infrastructure spending. If they can do that, then they can just get infrastructure spending, I think.
Well, not quite, because these are private companies. And, the government has released several reports and saying, hey, this is a problem, and these private companies aren't particularly fond of spending the money to actually do it. They did beef up security. I don't think they did it to the tune that it probably should have been, but they did succeed in actually getting PG&E to spend a considerable amount of money upgrading their security systems around their power substations as a result of that. And of course, not having a single even suspect and leaving this entire attack completely unresolved in any way, shape, or form. I think they're probably right with there was an insider on it, because where they hit was very, very specific. It's not like they just shot up the whole dang thing.
Would that make you, if they came up with suspects, would that make you less likely to believe this was a conspiracy? Like this was a staged government attack?
If they came up with, like, say, we found out that the Central California militia, we suspected them of having done this. We have, good evidence to maybe even charge them or at least investigate it. Yeah, I absolutely would. I'd be like, okay, well, maybe not government, but we don't have any suspects at all.
So I guess I'm curious, why would you trust the government's saying they have that evidence when you believe that the government just shot up a substation so that it could force a private company to beef up its infrastructure?
Because different parts of the government do different things. It's like you have state government, which is investigating this, along with federal government, and it's like if something like this were to have happened, it probably would have been from a federal agency, not a state agency. So it's just one of those. If they actually produced suspects that they had evidence for, I mean, they would have to have some sort of evidence to come up with. I'm actually kind of shocked that they haven't released any kind of theory around it. They've just said, and then the reports, all of the after reports that they put on there, essentially came up with, we don't got a clue. This is what we know happened, and then that's the end of the story. And then and the fact that it didn't seem to be pursued too much beyond that. It's like the FBI more or less spent 6 months. They brought in people from the federal. Oh, what the heck was it? They have to do with war planning and things like that to come in, and they spent 6 months investigating this. Released a report, and all the report said was what happened. They gave no indication as to what could have possibly been any motives for this. I mean, they're just that information just is they don't know. So is it possible that an explanation would be there's an ongoing investigation into these militias and the government doesn't want to release any information or give the impression that it's aware of the situation because of the wanting to pursue that ongoing investigation and try to sort of draw in more significant individuals?
Let me interrupt for 1 second. Is Andrew, I'd like you to answer that, but I do want to, because this case happened a while back, so I do want to get as Andrew, I also want to have you ask if you have any more questions on sort of the current situation that's going on now for the larger political issue, because we're going to start running a little tight on time. So please answer that question, and if you got any more questions, please feel free to ask them.
I've already forgotten. I'm doing too many things. What was
the question was, why isn't it more plausible that the government is engaged in an ongoing investigation that might involve, undercover individuals or, informants or things like that, and so is presenting the impression that it has no information because it doesn't want to spook, or mess up any of those ongoing projects?
Because of how long it's been, and the fact that we know that the CIA in particular has done this around the world.
Okay, the second one doesn't help us, but the first one, do we know how long these investigations into militias usually take?
Probably not 15 years. I mean, this isn't like what I came up with when I first heard about it.
You're talking about specifically an attack from 15 years ago. I thought we were talking about some more recent attacks as well.
It was 10 years ago.
No, the most recent one in Washington. There's the North Carolina one, right?
Oh, yeah, sorry. 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, see. Yeah, okay. That's not the one in North Carolina,
that was,
though, right?
No, that's not the one in North Carolina. That's the Metcalf.
I thought you were talking about the one in North Carolina.
No. This one's the Metcalf one that happened in 2013. The one that happened in North Carolina was more like the Metcalf station. I was delineating between just something that's just random vandalism versus something like the Metcalf attack, which was a very coordinated attack against the substation, and that they're very different things, and they seem to be linking a lot of them together.
Right, and I think it's reasonable to talk about ones that are clearly targeted attacks in this kind of way versus the kind of vandalism ones. In terms of the conspiracy, I think it still remains more plausible to me that there was an investigation and they either just genuinely didn't find enough information to target anybody, or they didn't, further investigations that we don't find out about because they resulted in other things happening or addressing other issues that they couldn't end up, pressing charges on this particular case or something like that. That just seems, intuitively more plausible to me than the government attacked its own substation in such a way where it knew that it could create just enough damage for a private company to have to, there's too much, it becomes too Rube Goldberg, I think, at that point. But again, that's the problem of discussing conspiracism in the modern world. When is it too Rube Goldberg? And I think the answer is, there's a couple of ways you can look at stuff, but generally a lot of these real conspiracies are fairly straightforward for the most part. It's a fairly basic quid pro quo or a fairly ham-handed attempt to manipulate things, in some way that gets kind of revealed over time. So, it's hard to assess what is and what isn't, but I do think that I think that we can try to shy away from certain things without further evidence. So, when you said, for example, the CIA has done this around the world, by that logic, you can run wild with false flag conspiracy thinking, right? Sandy Hook, everything could be a false flag because, hey, the CIA has done this before. And sure, the CIA, some government agencies shot up the Black Panthers. Absolutely. So how do you balance that is very tricky. But I don't think that's a particularly plausible action as opposed to, being involved with overthrowing a South American government, for example.
Well, you had suggested earlier that one way to improve the situation would be to, when you get the news story that feeds into your particular biases, feeds into what you want to hear, to take a step back. And I remember doing this when the Time magazine cover, or with Trump from that fake Time magazine interview, where Trump's like, if I wanted to become president, it would be easy. I'd just become a Republican. They're idiots. They'll believe anything, which of course was that was not. He never said that. That was a fake quote. So if you're on the left right now, a lot of people are feeling like, okay, they're starting to get scared by what they're seeing. They're feeling like things are getting a little out of control. So one thing, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you're on the left, presumably, hopefully, you're gonna check your sources. On the right, as you had suggested, I think that they are less inclined to do that. You've got Fox News, you've got an organization that is deliberately trying to, as you had said, heavily curate the news. So what can you offer to improve this situation where, we find a way to de-escalate this feedback loop, if that's what it is? I think that's what it is, if I'm kind of extrapolating from what you said, but if that's an accurate representation, how do we de-escalate that? If part of that is on the left saying, I'm going to check my sources, I think that's a great idea. I'm inclined to suspect that the right's going to be less inclined to do that, at least the far right that we're talking about in this set of circumstances.
Yeah, this is a hard question because I think the things that we would love would be the answer, which is personal, capacity, help teach critical thinking, check your sources, check the dates on a story before you share it. One of the most common mistakes, people will share stories that are 10 years old, like they're, breathlessly new reporting kind of stories. But I think the first thing I would say is, we're going to have to change the ecosystem, the environment that people are living in epistemically. We're not going to make people that are immune to misinformation at the scale that we are experiencing it in our culture currently. I don't think. That you're barraged by things of, and the AIs are just going to get better at making, fine tuning the flavor so that it's just the right amount of delicious, that you don't, have that reaction that I told you. It's going to be an arms race for all time in that kind of way. So I think, you have to look at the system level and say, what could we do to change this environment? And I think the answer is going to be heavier content moderation and, decreasing of the potential for virality, which is going to essentially put a cap on how successful social media business can be if its goal is to increase attention. This is the same problem with news, right? If you really want to make better news, you got to take out the ad-based profit motive. And if you're going to do that, where's the money going to come from? Well, it's either going to come from subscribers, in which case you're going to get audience capture, or it's going to come from the government, in which case you're going to get fear of government indoctrination. But there's a reason that NPR is still a really reliable news source as compared to a lot of media. What would I love to see? I would love to see the opposite of what's happening on Twitter right now. I would love to see Twitter run by someone who actually thinks about things for more than 3 seconds before posting them, doesn't let a bunch of really dangerous conspiracy theorists and, ethno-nationalists back onto the platform, and doesn't, ban reporters and things like that. That would be a good start. And then you'd want to talk about, how do you have Twitter in a way that I don't know if you've been following, this is probably a rhetorical question, right? Because you probably did 10 episodes on it, but the Twitter files, right? You have these stories that I think are, help us understand what it looks like to actually do content moderation at the highest level in society. And it's messy, but I think it's essential. I think Donald Trump should have been banned, and I think that was the right choice. And I think they made it in the right way as best one could in that situation, for example. And I think trying to let him back onto Twitter, trying to let, Kanye, we saw how that went, letting Kanye back onto Twitter, this is going in the wrong direction. And then, we've got to break the pipeline, especially for older, more conservative individuals, into the far right conspiracism, because there really is a problem of, you start with something basic like Fox News, and then you're on OAN, and then you're, Q-pilled, and you are worried that your grandchildren are going to be human trafficked or something. And even if you don't do anything, even if you never shoot anybody, you've still had your life significantly decreased in quality because you have this paranoid fantasy now that is gripping you and making you miserable, because that will keep your attention. That will keep you on that resource. These are the many problems that we have to address. And I think part of the way we address it is just being honest about the fact that we are not going to create hyper-rational beings who can resist this stuff. A lot of the work is going to have to come from really serious human-based content moderation.
All right. Is Andrew, any final thoughts?
Sorry, I'm arguing with parking attendants
Oh,
while
oh,
we're doing
oh.
this.
All right. I can come back to you.
Come back to me in just a second.
I will. So Aaron, thank you very much for coming on. Do you have any final thoughts? You're watching what's going on Twitter. And by the way, the head of Trust and Safety had to flee his house, and there are people trying to kill him because he was doing that moderation. So, and Musk released oh my God, it's
and he was accused of being a pedophile, of supporting child pornography. Like, that's all of the queer moral panic stuff is really horrifying to me, because I do think there's a high risk of violence against LGBTQ individuals. At the same time, what I want to say is I think we should be really concerned about the way the Republican Party is going politically, and that I would be curious what your co-host thoughts are, if they're willing to say whether they agree that this stuff does really seem to be consuming the political right at the moment. I don't think.
We may have lost him again. Let's
terrorism.
There. You go.
Nope.
Oh, you're back.
Nope, I'm back.
You said I do think, and then that's it. We lost you.
Oh, I do think that we should talk about the politics on the right, and I'd be curious your co-host's views on the degree to which conspiracism is gripping politics on the right, and how we break out of that kind of spiral. I think if we can break out of that, then a lot of things will course. God damn it!
I heard that.
No, we heard that. That got through.
All right, I'm back and moving slowly.
Well, I can talk about. Yes, I see an increase in conspiracy, unfounded rhetoric on the right. I am not a fan of the Republican Party. I don't like them. I don't like the Democratic Party either. I don't like either of them. I'm not entirely sure how you break out of that. I'm not sure if we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have a good answer on it either. It's
that was actually going to be my final question. It's okay, so how do we fix that? That I always try and ask. People are like, okay, these are some pretty big problems. These are concerning. And I'm like, okay, well, you've got to have an idea of what maybe we should do to fix it. Do you have an idea?
It's a bad situation because cult deprogramming individually doesn't work well. I don't see how you break the politics angle, because the Republicans are going to have to eat a lot of losses before they can have a new strategy, it seems to me. And then you have the problem that we're a democracy. And so what we would need to do would be, like I said, content moderation. And that content moderation is going to hit the right harder because there's more conspiracism, and they're going to react negatively to that. So I'm not sure how you avoid feeding the loop in that kind of way. But I do think, that's the problem that we have to be trying to fix, bit by bit, essentially. One last thing I wanted to add, we didn't get to it, we didn't even try to define stochastic terrorism. And there are folks on the right who will argue that this is just a silencing technique, like the term conspiracy theorist, that it's just used to shut down, extreme positions on the right or something like that. There are times where that is to some extent potentially the case, but I do think there really is a serious problem of escalating, demonizing rhetoric towards your political opponents. Inevitably.
Oh, there he goes. Now you see, if he had been on the right, people would be accusing me of having my hand on the that right wing guest that we have on to prove how impartial we are. I don't know why his mic keeps cutting out. So, but he's on the left, so it's clearly not. If it's a conspiracy, it ain't my fault.
It could be the weather.
No, it is your fault.
Really cold here.
Oh, yeah, it's always my fault one way or another. So you were saying.
No, I probably have butchered it enough times already, I think.
Well, let me ask, how would you define stochastic terrorism, just so we got your definition before we go?
Sure. Yeah. So the original idea was essentially inciting violence in a probabilistic way. So you're not specifically saying you there go kill. Like the classic example I like has always been Henry II's. Will no one rid me of this meddling priest? Which is a bastardization, but it's a great line. The idea that like you can say, oh, this person is killing babies, this abortion killer is killing babies. I wish somebody would deal with this or something. And that, somebody's going to take that up, and you can't say which specific person it's going to be, but it's reasonable to think that someone's going to do it. Right. Look at the talk of cockroaches on the radio prior to Rwanda or something like that. Like there's a plausible connection between media and behavior. So I think the useful definition is when our rhetoric becomes so extreme that it significantly increases the likelihood of violence. Now, how do you deal with, thinking that like the right has become very extreme? How do you talk about, QAnon without having that effect? And my solution would be, you have to talk about the people with compassion, even the people who you think are dangerous. That like QAnoners are deeply misled, tragic figures. We shouldn't view them as evil demons, right? There are no evil demons in the world, just sad people who don't deserve to suffer, but do because of these systems. And so I think by promoting, that kind of universal compassion, you short circuit the demonization part of the conspiracy narrative, and hopefully undercut the feeling that like specific violence against individuals is going to be the solution to these problems.
Well, I'll disagree on one thing about no evil people. Clearly, you've never heard of Justin Bieber. What were you going to say, Xander?
Oh, you're so horrible. What did
the Bieber
do to you? Show me on a stall where the Bieber touched you.
Of all the people to hate, Bieber in particular.
No, you know what? It's because I was teaching high school when he started really doing it. He showed up at the what was it? The Anne Frank's house, the Anne Frank house, and wrote in the thing, hopefully she would have been a believer, and he can't climb the wall, so he has his bodyguard carrying him, and then he's egging houses, and it's like, okay, that's it. It's like he's gone over the edge with me. That's it. There's only so many. I'm willing to tolerate. I'm willing to say that just about anybody is a human being, absolutely anybody, except Justin Bieber. So what were you gonna say, Xander?
Such well thought out reasons.
Yeah, I've got a list. I've got a list. We're gonna do a show. We'll do a show.
Are you checking it twice?
Yeah. I don't need to. It's a solid list. It's Bieber. Give me a break.
And you question me on my pet conspiracy theories. It's like I call them my pet conspiracy theories because I just like them. Not that I think there's anything to truly justify them. I just like those ones. Those are my pet conspiracies.
I think everybody should get a pass for just one, as long as it's not too bad.
When it comes to like trying to fix some of this stuff, trying to get rid of the only thing that I can even come close to thinking of is focusing on philosophy and critical thinking, especially in school, starting in kindergarten. And that's not going to fix it today. It's not going to fix it tomorrow. And it's going to be a fight today to try and get a lot more philosophy into schools. I think philosophy, I've really changed my mind on philosophy over the years. I used to not give a crap about it and just thought it was boring. It's like, don't even talk to me about philosophy. And I've changed my mind quite a lot. And I believe that it's critically important for kids to learn philosophy starting very young, and critical thinking skills as well. I think there's a dramatic dearth of critical thinking skills and philosophical practices in America today. And, at least if we try and fight that fight, we're at least getting multiple benefits, not just, trying to reduce some of the conspiracy beliefs that are running around in different parties and on the different extremes. But I don't know how we fix some of the problems we have now. The problems are incredibly complicated, and something I think I'm coming to believe more and more is things are the way they are for a reason. And when you start trying to meddle around with outcomes that you don't particularly like, you peel back that first layer and realize just how far down everything goes, and how many different things you're going to have to try and fix in order to fix this one outcome.
I actually
and it
agree
makes
with you about
things.
that. I think it's the problem of modernity that we know too much now, and I think it's a good thing. Like I would much prefer the modern medicine that we have, even though it's meddling as hell. But I think what the crisis of meaning is a crisis of recognizing that there is so much that we don't know and so much that we do know that undercuts a lot of our core beliefs in crucial ways. I do, agree with you that we need philosophy very early, though you have to understand that means people like me are going to be teaching your young children. And again, that is not going to go over well for a lot of people. But I also think that you're not going to like my answer, which is if you want to solve this on a large scale, you have to get rid of radical wealth inequality. You have to get rid of low road capitalism. You have to get rid of meritocracy. I think that meritocracy is toxic and at least in the way that we are practicing it in our world. And I don't see a better way to practice it. And I think when people fail in a system they believe that's meritocratic, their anger gets repressed and comes back out as conspiratorial rage and anti-Semitism and stuff like that.
All right, so here's what I've done. I just time-stamped what you just said, and the reason is, what we're going to do is we're going to go back, and between that, you said you had a friend who did the media porn, and I think we've got now a list of things that we're going to want to not only bring you back for, but try to start dragging your friends into. Thank you very much for coming. And this ended up being, I think there's a lot to unpack. So hopefully you'll come back. We had a great time having you here.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on all the pod apps, Embrace the Void, Philosophers in Space for the 2 shows. You can check me out at ETVPod on Twitter. You can check out the Philosophers in Space Facebook group is a really fun place to come hang out. And the UK Skeptic Mag. I have a monthly article that will be starting back up in January.
And it is entirely my fault. We don't have the links right now in the chat, but we will get them.
Don't lie.
Well, I had asked, but I also knew enough. I could have put some in, and I tried to do that. I knew who you were. I knew the Void Pod. I had your website. They should have been in before the show. That is my fault. So I appreciate you. No, I'm sorry. You know what? We're both wrong. It's 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷𝑒ring's fault. This is completely 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷𝑒ring's fault. And, that's why I always go with the co-host.
Conservative. You should take some responsibility.
I know, right? Oh, God.
Where is the personal responsibility in all of this, honestly?
Well, fortunately he's quiet instead of pointing out, Nick, you only told me about the show an hour beforehand. But
well, I will actually point out that, or I will take responsibility for getting derailed into my pet conspiracy theory that we went way too far on that and didn't, and it wasn't even fun.
I had a good time.
Got sidetracked.
We'll have you back to, and I don't know if you, Mr. X or Doctor. He doesn't just go by Dr. X or Dr. Conspiracy, but we've had him on a couple of times, and I mentioned him to you at one point. We'll maybe bring you guys on, or at least hook the two of you up.
It's better internet for next time too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you better fix that internet thing. It's like
I'll sort it out.
All right.
I'll try the app next time and see what's better.
So for those of you who are just joining us, go back to the beginning. It was a great show, but come join us on the Discord. You'll find all these kinds of discussions and more. We will be having we probably won't be doing Commander Macmillan on Thursday. Discuss the holiday thing in a bit, but we will be having Operator Starsky, a Ukrainian National Guardsman, reporting from Kyiv about giving us an update on what's been going on in the last week, and we will have Commander Lance Macmillan with us for that as we try to talk about what's going on in the military and the diplomacy in Ukraine. Thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you Thursday and Friday. Have a good night, all.